Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, this is the time to ask it. Maybe we'll take two quick questions.
My question is, if, like, say, you mentioned that there are seizures of all these products of live animals, the carcasses and all that. In particular, for the live animals, what is done following, the seizure, like to the animals? How are they treated? Because of course there's going to be like injuries or... So is there any protocols in place for the immediate treatment or rehabilitation?
There are some guidance documents on the CITES, for example, which do deal with this. They're not as clear as they can be. It's unclear how much countries are applying them and how useful they actually are. Each country tends to be quite different in what it does. Some countries are very good. Some countries simply don't have the capacity or the knowledge base to treat, especially exotics. There just isn't the knowledge there. So you can have some quite pitiful situations with some of this seized wildlife. Repatriation is always to be encouraged when possible, with obvious protocols of health and disease being followed and proper care. So they do exist. There are measures at the moment being looked at to try to develop that guidance that I mentioned under CITES. So hopefully that will only improve.
If I'm not mistaken, the current wave of hunting in South African region has been triggered by the 2008 shipment of ivory from China to Japan or something. Why are they not uplisting the elephant trafficking to Appendix 1? What is the reason behind it?
Okay, so yes, the 4 Southern African countries were successful in downlisting their populations of elephants from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. So prior to that, the ban that came in 1989 was a blanket ban for all populations, but they were successful. Pretty much as soon as the ban came in 1989, efforts were made to undermine that ban. And at successive CITES meetings, attempts were made to downlist certain populations, and they were successful ultimately. In the case of those four countries, the ivory was auctioned, and when it was auctioned, we certainly saw an increase in price in the market and an increase in poaching. The rationale there being applied was that ivory would satisfy the demand, and the money raised could go towards conservation activities. There's very little evidence that any conservation took place with those funds. Since then, however, we've been through some very dark times with ivory trafficking and elephant poaching. At the moment, things we're cautiously optimistic, because although we believe that ivory trafficking is still alive and well, the domestic bans that have been implemented in the US, there's a sort of not a very good ban being proposed for the EU and for the UK, and that's currently being challenged actively. But certainly the most significant ban that's been committed to is the Chinese ban. By the end of the year, it should be a wholesale ban across the country. And the price of ivory that we've seen at its height, I believe it was around $1,700–$1,800. That has gone down significantly to, I believe, around $700. That's in the last year or so. So there are encouraging signs. Those 4 African countries that you referred to, they have to be willing to uplist their elephants. Ultimately, CITES sees them as their populations. There's a lot of sovereignty rights around populations of wildlife that are in certain countries, obviously. Other countries could propose it. There probably won't be the appetite politically to go up against those 4 countries without their buy-in into the process of uplisting those elephants. So I'd say it's unlikely to succeed. This is why it's important to, again, blanket bans and don't come back and don't undermine those by sort of creating these separate markets, because then there's complete confusion, by people who don't necessarily enforcement agencies and people who don't necessarily understand CITES but are required to regulate it and enforce it. Is it in Appendix 1? Is it in Appendix 2? Which country did it come from? It just causes problems and causes loopholes.
If there are no other questions, maybe I can just pose a question with a comment from Gabriel on this. But there's a school of thought in this country that the local laws, the FFPO, the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, is a very strong legislation and protects all wildlife. Whereas this is not necessarily my view, but the school of thought on this, that says that by being a signatory to CITES, that actually you are encouraging trade. And because Sri Lankan laws actually ban any kind of wildlife trade. So there's a zero trade limitation. So just your comments on that, just quickly.
Yes, certainly. Sri Lanka can choose to do what it wants, is a short and simple answer. CITES can decide that a species warrants an Appendix 2 protection, but Sri Lanka can certainly decide that no, actually we're quite happy with our ban, total ban. There's no obligation by parties to CITES to weaken their existing laws in order to accommodate decisions by CITES on specific listings. It's absolutely not the case. So whether that creates a perception, that laws could be weakened simply because CITES says that they have certain species have a certain status is debatable. I'm not sure that there is that climate created by certain listings, but certainly Sri Lanka is not constrained in any shape or form to weaken its own legislation.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for that really comprehensive and in-depth talk on the wildlife trade. In Sri Lanka, we don't get to hear, there is headline news on the wildlife trade, but apart from that, we are unaware of how many of these things take place between countries, because we are often involved in our own wildlife issues here. But increasingly, we find that we are probably a transshipment point now. And as you said, since our ports are opening and our airports are expanding, and there are separate legislation or deals where free trade areas and long-term leases are being signed, everything can change for us. And for some of us in conservation, what we really fear is that our own wildlife will, as it were, go down the sinkhole as the international trade around us grows, the illegal trade. So it's actually timely, as you said, for us to take notice of what's happening, and also be aware that this is a transition time for us, and that if we are not vigilant, we will be always running to catch up with something that's moving much faster than we are. What I want to ask you is, what is the area that we have to really sensitize in, whether in government or whether it's among the general populace, to face these changing times? I know you mentioned that there are many things that we can do, but what is the single most important area of government, or where do we have to increase our capacity? That's just one short question.
I would always come back to, because intelligence-led enforcement is so critical, I would always come back to being able to build a capacity for monitoring of what is actually happening. Recording seizures is one indicator of what's happening, but it's not all of them. It's not everything. It's not the full picture. So there can be trafficking activity without there being seizures. Being able to conduct operations by following goods which are coming in to until it arrives to a point where you can really make a significant arrest. That kind of information is very valuable, and what the information that can enable that to happen is critical. But you have to really get an idea of what is happening around you, and you can only do that by uniting enforcement agencies and communities and people like yourself, NGOs, as well as the general public, to really come together and to mobilize as one in order to provide that information and assist where possible. So it's awareness raising, but it's also actually putting in place some very clear systems and protocols to bring that information under one roof.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't normally come here and ask a question, but I think this is an extremely important topic that you're dealing with and you've come to talk to us about. And I can't stress to the audience here the importance of being aware of wildlife crime, international trade in wildlife, because much more comprehensively, much faster than that anything we have faced within the country in terms of poaching, in terms of the illegal interest in wildlife and wildlife products, this international link-up is going to change things for us. Just to conclude, thank you very much once again for coming in here to talk to us today. We are grateful that someone like you is spending some time in this country and also talking to other agencies and making Sri Lankans aware of what's at stake, because this is a wildlife-rich, biodiverse country, and we stand to lose a lot if we don't look sharp. One thing I wanted to say about Gabriel, I did mention that he is from an island 200 times smaller than ours. For those of you who are not aware, that is Malta. Am I correct? And so perhaps he has an affinity with islands, though this is quite a different island. Before I ask him to come up here and accept a token of gratitude, I just want to mention again that we are grateful to Nations Trust Bank for making this lecture series possible and actually helping to take these lectures to a different level. And ProImage for the video coverage, which we are going to be putting online, these lecture programs, and CJ and team at Sarva Advertising for the creative support, and of course Dilma for the tea service. Just a reminder to members about the gathering on the 10th of November, and also just a gentle reminder about members who have not paid their dues yet. Thank you very much.